Hi, and welcome to Lecture 7, Alternative Models. Today we're going to talk about taking a model we've already done and modifying it and trying to see how to improve the process. Okay, so recall the results of Nimitz Cafe Bar, and we had that experiment where we were playing with the initial capacity or the capacity of the barista server. And we had these sort of different statistics that we were looking at. The one thing we should look at is in all cases that cashier utilization was just under 5%. And that's very low. So we might want to think, well, that's an underutilized resource. So let's think about how we might modify that. So the idea that we're going to play with is that we're not really using that cashier. What happens if there's no cashier? And instead, we let the baristas man the cash register too. Now, this is a generalization of the model in the sense that we're going to say the person is not tied to their station. They can kind of be moving around. And if you think about a normal cafe, that's actually what happens. So this will accomplish two things. It'll allow us to analyze that, and it'll also sort of more faithfully model reality, which is always good. To do that in Simio, we're going to need to introduce a new object called a resource. Okay, so we're going to add a resource called baristas, and before we do that, we might want to rename things to better reflect what's going on in the model. Of course, this doesn't change the model by renaming it, but it does help us understand the model again when we reread it. So we change the cashier server to cash register and the barista server to coffee station. As always, I would suggest that you modify your model too. Okay, this is going to give you the best practice in creating these models. Okay, so when you create this resource that you called baristas, and you look at the properties window, you see that it has this sort of properties window. The first thing to look at is the capacity type. We're going to work with it as a fixed capacity. What that just means is that there's a constant amount of that resource throughout the simulation. The other type is called a work schedule, and that would be a time-varying amount of that resource. We'll talk about that later in the semester. So we'll leave that. So this initial capacity is, of course, a constant. It's 1. We're going to want to think about changing that so that we can parameterize by that. So that's what we're going to change, and we're going to make it the barista initial capacity. So instead of the barista initial capacity being the capacity of the server, remember we used this property before, we're going to instead put it here. So this is now going to change the baristas that are tied to a server, and instead we're going to tie them up to this resource. Okay, and when we do that, we need to think about changing that server too. Okay. So we also have to change the server. Okay. So now we have a cash register. Oh, and how do we change the server? We're going to, we can either, well, I'm going to put a question mark here. You don't necessarily need to change it. We can actually leave that the way it is right now, and that's just going to reflect there's room enough at that server for however many baristas we have to work there simultaneously. That might not be the reality, so a future model, we might want to think about how much space is there to work there. Okay, for now, we're not going to worry about that concern, and we'll just leave it as barista initial capacity. Okay, so now when we go to the cash register, though, we need one of these baristas to be manning it. And so the way in which we do that is you click on the cash register server, and you look down to the secondary resources, and we're going to expand that out by clicking that plus. Okay, so when you hit the plus, you're going to see the thing you want to look for is before processing, because that's when you need to have a barista to help you. So we'll click on that plus. And when you do that, you're going to see there's the 3 buttons when you highlight that, and you want to click those 3 buttons, and it'll bring up this window. Okay. And you click add, and then that will add this blue stuff, and it'll also add this bit into this window over here. The object type, that allows us to specify a specific object or objects from a list. And we see it's called specific, so it can't be it has to be the ones that we specify. The name is going to be the specific object that we select. And then the number of objects here, that'll be the other thing, that'll be the amount of the resource that you need. Okay, so if we go back up here, a name, we'll see from the drop-down list that you can click that we can pick baristas. That's what we want to pick, that's the resource we want to use. And so you just select that, and then you can, once you've done that, and you see that this is one, you can, and as long as this is back to baristas, you can close the window. Okay, now we have the resource. If this is all we did, you might think, well, that's enough. This is going to follow the customer around. But of course, the resource has to be released. It's been seized, but now it has to be released. If you forget this step and you just try to run the model, you're going to get this error. It's going to tell you, hey, an entity went through the system, in this case a customer, and we never released the resource it seized. So if this pops up, you know that you have a problem with the seizing, with the releasing of your resource. So how do we release? Well, we're going to release, if they go to self-service, we want to release it there before they even begin processing, because self-service means that the person paid and then went over to this counter without the barista. So now we click and we look down, we click on secondary resources, but now we look at other resource releases, and we're going to want to release it on entering, because it's even before they get there, before they're processing, they've released the barista. And basically it's the same setup as we did when we were seizing the resource. We hit the 3 buttons, we get the same kind of window. We click add again, we select baristas, we leave everything else the same. It's the same idea, okay? For the coffee station, it's now if you go to the coffee station, you need the barista, and note that we've left the capacity there to be the same. So we're going to assume there's always enough room for however many baristas we have to work there. This might be changed in the future to better reflect reality. And then, of course, here before you process, you have this barista. That's cool. But after you're done processing, you want to release it. So once the barista is done making the drink, you want to release the resource. So you look at this, you expand out the secondary resources again. You look at the other resources released, and we want to look at this after processing bit. Once you hit the after processing, you fill it the same way as we filled everything else up. So it's the same basic idea. Okay, so now we have our Nimitz coffee bar all set up. Now we can start looking at results. So if we run this was the original results, and this is after we've changed the system. Okay, so if we look at this, we see the numbers have changed quite a bit. Let's see how it changed. If you look at these numbers, they're higher for 1. They're even higher for 2 baristas. If you look at the cashier register utilization, you see those numbers have all gone up. You look at barista utilization, this is pretty much the same at the coffee station. The resource utilization now, so this is a resource utilization, this is a new number, but you can think of it and contrast it to this server utilization. It's gone up a little bit here. And then the wait times, if you look at the barista wait time though, that's actually gone down quite a bit for 1. It's even gone down a bit for 2, which is interesting. The average time in system, in the new system, basically it increases if you have 1 barista, and then you see that it's about the same once you get to 2 baristas or more. Now you might be thinking, well, is this better or worse? Well, here's first thing you have to keep in mind. in this original model, remember, when we had a barista capacity of 1, 2, 3, or 4, that represents 2 workers, because in the original model, you have your baristas plus you have a cashier. Okay, so this has 1 less worker down here. So that's an improvement. That's cheaper. The second thing, you can see that with 2 workers, right? So the right comparison point is actually this line and this line. And you can see that the 2 workers, as long as you kind of let them float, you don't insist one has to be a cashier and one has to be a barista, you actually get just strictly better results, right? You have better wait times, you have better utilization. It reduces the utilization of the baristas actually quite a bit because you're splitting the work between 2 people rather than just one person using it all. And then you actually get a better time in system. So understanding that this one actually corresponds to 2 workers allows us to make a more apples to apples comparison. Whereas if you kind of naively just looked at that, you might think, oh, I should compare the first line to the first line. But no, you should be comparing the first line to the second line, and the second line to the third line, and so on and so forth. And that sort of should motivate us to think, oh, yeah, this is definitely a better thing to do. So the punchline is, yes, allow baristas to work the cash register.